thanks for joining us today. And just on behalf of everybody, congratulations on a really great, well-produced documentary. So much to unpack here, right? And we could probably talk for the next 2 hours on all of this, but let me just kind of start from the beginning and ask you, what inspired you to tackle this topic? Are you from a farming region? Did you grow up on a farm? And you and your creative partner, did you was this something that is a topic that you've dealt with for a long time? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, really, thanks for having me, and it's great to have our film featured, tonight. So thank you for that. Um, for my wife Annie and I, we did a film before this called Sustainable, and the film was really about the environment and about the land and what the land really needed to survive and how we needed to change our ways of farming. And Dr. John Eichard was actually featured in that film, and while we were interviewing him for that film, he started to get into this whole area that I always refer to as the dark side of agriculture, kind of this unknown area that where people are fighting these battles in rural America that we don't know about. And Annie and I were just really moved by that. And we knew we wanted to follow up a film that was mostly about the environment with a film that was more about environmental injustice, a film that really connected the issues with health, with the issues of the environment, and that all tied into how people farm and what we need to do to change our farming.
Okay, great. And like I said a moment ago, there's so much to unpack here. In through your research and putting this together, does it seem like this disproportionately impacts a lot of rural, aka poor citizens? Or was I think the rest of us, were we right in picking that up? Does that seem like something where there's definitely an imbalance of power between these large corporations and poor citizens in these rural areas?
These corporations are targeting towns specifically that don't have a lot of money, that are filled with low-income citizens, and oftentimes minority citizens. And they're just looking for very little resistance. So they're looking for a county that is not going to have challenges at the municipal level. And that's why there are actually there was a serious fight in Kansas actually a couple of years ago about Costco trying to put chicken barns in a small town, and the town actually won that battle. And the Costco ended up finding a town in the southeast for that plant. That plant's actually the story behind how Costco was able to do a $5 broiler chicken, because they were able to vertically integrate their operation so that they controlled the processing, they controlled the egg laying, they control the slaughtering, then they control the marketing to the consumer. So that's what a lot of these corporations are looking to do. They're looking to maximize efficiency of their production, and that's what you get. But thankfully, there are towns where there are wins, and we saw some of them in the film, and there continue to be towns actually with more wins. We've seen more wins in the more recent year and a half than since the film's come out, so which is also great.
Oh, that's great. So since putting this project together, as you know, we've had a change in leadership in Washington, D.C. Now, granted, most of these decisions are at the state and county level. Do you expect anything maybe to shake loose at the federal level when it comes to these kinds of issues?
I'll be interested to see. Thankfully, there has been a bill to put somewhat of a moratorium on these CAFOs, at least expansion of these CAFOs, and that was introduced by Senators Cory Booker, and it was co-signed by Elizabeth Warren. And so that was very promising. I don't think it made it to any sort of committee, but as was the case in local politics with Maria, who was featured in this film, the first time they presented that Healthy Air Act bill to the Maryland state government, it never made it out of just a bill being introduced. It never made it to committee, and then it made it to committee, and then it made it through committee, and then it got to the Senate floor. And if you look at the track record of like how fracking was banned, the fracking ban was an 8-year process from the time the bill was introduced to the time the ban actually passed. And now I think there's 2 states, or there's multiple states with fracking bans. So I think what we need is, we really need one state to really step up and say, we're going to do this. We're going to create a precedent for for legal reasons. I think more can happen at the state level than at the federal level. What I'd love to see the new federal government tackle is the whole environmental injustice balloon as it is, because that really encompasses, you know, any sort of rural communities that are living by any sort of factory, whether it's a power plant or a coal burning plant, or whether it's fracking or anything. So I think there's a lot of work that they can do in that sector, and hopefully the CAFO issue ties in with that, because it, you know, very much is very similar issue.
You know, and Pat, feel free to jump in here too if you have a question, but it's always interesting that we sort of have this image, and maybe it's just me, but maybe others agree too, that we have this sort of image of farmers being sort of like these family farms, you know, Farmer Joe with his overalls, tilling the land, toiling away all day. And even in the piece at near the beginning, there was a, you know, one of these places was called the so-and-so family farm or something like that. You know, what in your experience when you were putting this together, we're really not talking about family operations, are we? Are we talking about big corporations that might try to slide in under this sort of family image, or is that what you found when you were putting this together, that we're really not talking about, you know, family farms, you know, neighbor-owned businesses here?
Actually, in many cases, we're still talking about family farms. In the dairy industry specifically, the dairy industry hasn't gone to a model where the people who work the barns are contractors. And that's really how it's working in chickens, and that's how it's working in pork, where the birds are all completely owned by the chicken company, Pilgrim's Pride or Tyson or whoever it is. And then all they do is have these contractors who basically service these barns as almost as janitorial work, right? So those, in that sense, that's not family farmed, but actually the entities often that own those, they're so consolidated, but they do still go back to large family operations. So both in hogs and in dairy specifically, you still see a lot of these farms that are family farms. So when they advertise to the general public that they're coming from family farms, they are coming from family farms, but these are multi-billion-dollar family farms. You know, family farms that own 50 farms, right? That own thousands of chicken barns or thousands of hog barns, or some of the largest dairy operations in the state of Wisconsin. The one interesting thing is when there was the whole trade war that was going on with China over soybeans. That was 2 years ago. It was a huge issue, and China wasn't going to buy our soybeans. And so the government had a bailout plan for soybeans. The farmer who received the highest soybean bailout in Wisconsin was a dairy farmer. And dairy farmers far and away in the state of Wisconsin receive a large percentage of that bailout money, because they own the soybeans for feed, and then the feed goes to their operations. So you're seeing a lot of help from the government in terms of supporting an industry that really needs to change.
So Matt, when recently, you know,
Pat, can you lean into your microphone a little bit more?
thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know. Is that better?
Yeah.
Just be
Can you hear him,
louder.
Matt?
Use my 500 seat theater voice. Is that what I need? So Matt, when recently we had the whole issue with Canada and the dairy products, our farmers in Wisconsin being kicked because of competition from Canada. Can you speak a little bit about how this works into that? I mean, I suppose that I always had the idea that this was the tiny little farms and they were just being, you know, ruined by the Canadian big guys? Is it just the big guys versus the big guys, and that's what I didn't really get?
I think regarding that issue, the interesting thing about dairy is it's in about a 30-year decline. So anyone who's in the dairy industry is entering an industry that is in permanent decline, so to speak, because looking at the track record. And in Wisconsin specifically, you lose more dairy farmers in Wisconsin than you lose any farmers in any other state. And I think in 2019, they lost over 500 dairy farmers in that year. So more than one a day is what they're losing. It used to be a state that was a whole bunch of really small dairy operations, 100 cattle herd, 200, maybe 1,000, max. Now we're just seeing, upwards of 10 to 15,000 head herd. And I think what's going on in Canada is they likely have really good operations going that is reaching economies of scale. So they're able to maximize the production element of it, and they're able to undercut what's going on in the United States. I don't know all that much about it, but I'm interested to know if it's mostly Holstein operations or if it's other sorts of operations, because in the United States, it's the black and white cow that everyone sees in the pictures on the milk cartons. Those are called Holstein cows, and Holsteins are the most popular cow in the United States. I think they produce 7 gallons of milk a day. But the thing about Holsteins is the genetics come from very few bulls. Most of the genetics comes from less than 10 bulls across the United States. And you're talking about 10 million cows that are coming from the genetics of a handful of cows. And there's a lot of interesting research going on that's leading to the potential of that milk being more inflammatory. So what you're seeing, if you're someone who's interested in finding a pasture-raised milk product, you'll see a lot more Jersey cow operations. And a Jersey cow is something that it's not a cow that's been messed with genetically for the past 150 years. So it still retains a lot of what it was when it was earlier in domestication. And a really interesting thing on that point too is you look at a country like Austria that's 100% dairy independent, and their dairy cow consists of less than 2% Holstein. So in Europe, they're using very different genetics than what they're using here in the United States. And I think there's a huge lesson in that, both for the dairy industry and for consumers, that we really need to look at good genetics in terms of creating milk that's anti-inflammatory as opposed to inflammatory, because there's a huge difference out there. Yeah.
So as you've moved to talk right now about the impact on consumers, which should I assume that that's why Mark Bittman was really so interested and involved, because he's a foodie and it's the end product.
Yeah.
And
Mark was involved in my last film. I had interviewed him for Sustainable, and he was overly enthusiastic about the idea of being involved in this kind of film. That's why he came along for the ride. So, what you were saying?
Talk a little bit about, because they don't talk that much about the impact of all of this on food,
right?
And our food and the food that we're consuming. Can you speak to some of the issues there?
Sure. So these industries have always struggled to be profitable. Chickens was never a household everyday item on a dinner plate, really, until the Chicken McNugget in the 1980s made it really popular to eat chicken. And until then, families would eat chicken maybe once a month, maybe once every other week. And now we see it all the time. And similar things with hogs and beef. What really got these industries to reach economies of scale was the introduction of antibiotics into the feed. And that really started in the 1950s. And it was always low doses, what they call subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics. And that we know now that those subtherapeutic amounts of antibiotics has created antibiotic resistance for things that didn't used to kill us that are now killing us. And salmonella is a perfect example. And even E. coli is a really great example, because you didn't have E. coli outbreaks really before the late 70s, early 80s, when you started to get that. And suddenly you started to see penicillin and tetracycline and drugs that we were using for human purposes, they weren't effective. Why? Because they were being used for these factory farm-like operations. So on the level of how it affects our human health, and this is a topic I'm going into a little bit more in a new film I'm working on. We are eating meat that is tainted with very low levels of antibiotics, and what that is doing is creating resistance for humans to the antibiotics that we need to help take care of us. So if you add up all the killers that are associated with antibiotics in the United States, it was the 4th largest killer in 2018. So it's a pretty big deal, and it continues to be a bigger deal. And that's the main way that humans really right now are being affected by this supply.
So back to just the term sustainable from your first movie, and I'm sorry, I haven't seen it. I'm going to go look for it now. Your film company, when I went looking for Hourglass Productions, I found sustainable productions or sustainable filmmaking. Speak a little bit to what that means to you. Is that all about subject matter, or are those practices that you're bringing in to your filmmaking?
I think film's a really powerful tool. And I spent 12 to 15 years at doing work for hire for clients who asked me to do videos of all sorts of things. And what I recognized is the work that I was doing was having an impact in how that company was selling a product, or how that company was communicating a message to its constituents. And I recognize that video, to me, and filmmaking is a visual art that has the ability to really communicate a powerful message, and has the ability to make people think about different things in their life. When it came down to deciding what kinds of films I wanted to do, I make a very concerted effort to make sure that my films are going to somehow better the world, are going to help my children have a more successful life. And to me, that's what the idea of sustainability wuthin the filmmaking sector is. I truly believe that filmmakers have a unique opportunity to put topics on display in an art form that they choose, that can then be discussed by audiences, just like we're doing tonight. And it helps to raise awareness, and hopefully filmmakers can make a living doing it too. That's always the hardest part, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt, we have a few more minutes left. You mentioned just a second ago your next project that you're working on. Can you, maybe without giving away some secrets, tell us a little bit about what's your next topic that you're tackling?
Sure. So I mean, I'm this whole realm of food and agriculture is kind of my sector, and I didn't start that way. I came to this really out of my own health, out of discovery of amazing food. My wife introduced me to a farmer's market about 9 years ago, and it was a revolutionary experience for me. And I'm dedicated to trying to make the United States food system better. It needs so much help. And the motherships of the United States agricultural system are these CAFOs, and it is the meat production. And it can be done correctly. We used to have 60 million buffalo roaming the high plains of this country, and that maintained an ecosystem. That it has drought issues now. It was land that was really well managed prior to our involvement in having to manipulate it into annual crops and perennial crops. So with this new film, I'm looking at the issues I talked about a little bit, the antibiotic resistance issues. It's going to focus heavily on the antibiotic resistance, but it's also going to have a lot about the history of these industries, the history of how we got to where we got to today. What steps led us to this? Because what I find so fascinating is that along the way, when they figured out that they can add vitamin D to chicken feed in the 1920s, it was a revolutionary thing that allowed them to raise the birds indoors. And that's why we have 60,000 chicken coops today. They didn't know at the time what they were doing was bad. And when they introduced antibiotics in the 1950s, they didn't know it was bad. We now know it's bad, but we're not doing anything now. So the whole idea is to let's take a look back. Let's see what we did. Let's see why we did it. And I think hopefully audiences can walk away with an understanding that a lot of these decisions weren't made for bad reasons. So sure, some of them were made for economical reasons, but by and large, they were made to try to feed the world, as they always say. So now we know what we know. What are we going to do about it now? So those are topics that are explored in this next film.
Great. Definitely looking forward to that.